Question is, how much compensation do they get? As I said, as I was talking about last time, each company has to pay into workers' compensation whether they have a worker that has been injured or not. As soon as somebody does get injured, of course, then they have to up their payments. It's an insurance, so that you have to pay into the insurance to be part of it. For each worker that you have to pay a certain amount of money. And of course that upsets a lot of employers. And for that reason, what they will do is, if you're a part-time employee, they don't have to pay into workers' compensation for you. So if you're a full-time employee, they do. This is part of your compensation. So what they will do, a lot of dentists do this, a lot of doctors do this because they're cheap bastards. What they'll do is they'll have a nurse that works 32 hours instead of 40. And then they don't have to pay her into benefits. They don't have to give her health benefits, and they don't have to pay into workers' comp. And they do it because they're cheap bastards, like I said before. B-A-S-T-A-R. Okay, they're cheap. They're cheap. So they have to, for every full-time employee, they have to pay into workers' comp. I'm a full-time employee at Dementia College, so they have to pay into workers' comp for me. They also have to pay my Social Security. They also have to pay my Medicare. What else do they pay? Medicare, Social Security, workers' comp. There's whatever state taxes Arizona has. But they have to pay into all that. Actually, they don't have to pay into the state taxes. All they have to do is pay into the federal taxes, because this is a federal reservation. But then again, of course, they've been paying into this insurance, and theoretically the insurance pays me, not the company. But if I get hurt, one of the things they do is they pay me for my injury. And what they will do is they'll give me 66% of my paycheck. And that usually comes out of the insurance. That way it doesn't devastate the employer. And that's why the insurance is there. So it doesn't kill them if they have to pay for an injured party. You'll get about 66% of your paycheck, which doesn't really cover a whole lot. I mean, it does cover something, but it doesn't cover a whole lot. One of the reasons that they came up with Aflac, if you've ever seen the duck commercial, Aflac gives you extra money. So it's insurance, and a lot of companies are buying into Aflac. My wife worked for, she was running a clinic up in Montana, and they paid into Aflac. So every time I had a dental appointment, I get Aflac payments. As strange as this strange check for $35. The type, so it has to do with the type and the duration of the injury. How long did you stay out? One of the things that they have to do is they have to pay somebody else to come in and take your place. So of course the employer pays that, and then the workers' compensation insurance pays my salary. They pay the salary at the time of the injury, of course, at 66%. Workers can seek compensation for physical and psychological injuries suffered at work, the cost of whatever treatment is given, lost wages, of course, the loss of future earning capacity. Now, some employers, they will go to court rather than pay all this money. And the reason is because usually they get off better. So if they fight it. There are some employers that fight everything. As it turns out, Donald Trump was one of those guys. He wanted to deal. He's a deal maker, by golly, and he always wanted to deal. So if you were trying to charge him, $1 million for something, he would take you to court and try to get you to reduce it by $250,000. Put in marble tops on something, and you were trying to charge him $1 million, he would take you to court. Or he would refuse to pay you because he didn't like what you did. So you'd go to court, you'd sue him, and you'd go to court. And usually he settled out of court. So he never lost a case. He always settled out of court. But then again, most cases are settled out of court. Same way with workers' comp. You don't, this isn't the bottom, this isn't the bottom line. Now, the reality is, I don't know how many of you guys have lawyers, I certainly don't have one. So if I get screwed by my employer, what's the probability I'm going to have the money to sue them? It's going to cost me, I'll have to hire a lawyer and then we have to go to court. It's an ugly, ugly situation. Formal trials are not held as far as workers' compensation is concerned. Juries do not resolve these cases. They're heard and decided by a hearing officer or a commissioner. Clinicians are often asked to render an opinion about the existence, cause, and the implications of any mental disorders. And of course, you can sue for compensation for a mental problem if you're in a job that is highly stressful. Not this one probably. Working construction is usually you're not going to have a psychological injury, but if you're working in a hospital, for example, or if you're working as a psychologist, or you're working as a dentist. Dentists, of course, if you're working for an employer that is a jerk, then a lot of times you'll have mental problems. Claims for mental disability usually arise in three ways. Physical mental cases, a physical injury can lead to a mental disorder and psychological disability. Mental cases, an individual suffers a traumatic incident at work that leads to substantial psychological difficulties. You can imagine if you're a policeman and you're seeing all of these horrible, horrible things over and over and over again, potentially you can have start suffering from PTSD because of the traumatic incidences that you've been in, or you have a week where people keep pulling guns on you. I don't know if you've ever had a gun pointed at you. It's a little bit traumatic. It's not the most fun thing in the world. What was I thinking of? Oh yeah, okay. There's most guns have a safety, so you can flip it on or flip it off, so that you can't pull the trigger. Okay, I'm not going to tell that story. It's all right. Even though it's Veterans Day, I'm not going to tell that story. I got captured.
Workman's comp. Where you were talking about workman's comp.
Yeah.
I was working, and I had to run here to the Gutchagay. From work, I worked at Chinley.
Yeah.
So then I was driving back, and I had a ride coming from Chinley side. So it started coming into the
Drifting over into your lane?
Yeah, so I ran off the road, and I got into an accident. I fractured my back, so I was on the clock, but they never paid me workman's comp. I was out from my job for about 3 months.
And they never paid you anything?
Nothing. So I suffered the consequences of it, and I'm thinking of hiring a lawyer to...
Sure. Yeah.
Because I have to suffer the physical pain of it today.
Oh, sure.
So I never hired anyone to...
Was it the tribe that you were...
Yeah, Department of Behavioral Health Services, Treatment Center. They sent me out on to do aftercare. I was out there, and then I was coming back, and that's what happened to me.
You should have no problem getting that one paid. I would think you should have workers' comp. Despite the fact it's the tribe, you didn't sign anything that said, if I get injured on the job, you don't have to compensate for me.
Yeah.
That's against the law for one thing to do that. It's against the law for them to ask you to do that. My goodness. Yeah, sure. Hire a lawyer, because it's going to cost you.
Yeah, I'm thinking...
Yeah, you're going to have money on the front end to get money at the back end.
Yeah, that's the thing. Gonna have to sell a lot of cattle.
There you go. Yeah, and then hire a lawyer. Hire a lawyer that understands the reservation, my goodness. Good luck with that.
The thing about that is, when I talk about workman's comp, or the question is, how much do I ask for, or what do I ask for? What's
Your lawyer.
decent?
Your lawyer. What you'll sue for is the 3 months of back wages that you weren't paid. And they'll probably, like I said, 66% of your wages. So they'll probably divide it down, or they'll multiply it out, so you're not gonna get 100%. But then you can also sue for, well, you've got IHS though, you were treated by IHS. But it's still there, right? You still have a pain. Okay. So, yeah, potentially you can sue for emotional damage that could be caused by this. I knew that was gonna happen. It was like a train wreck and I saw it happen all by myself. That's great. Mental, okay, so this is the Travis case right here. Mental, physical, if a work-related stress leads to an onset of physical conditions such as high blood pressure, and you can sue for that as well. Workers' compensation. Some people are fairly delicate, not a car accident doesn't have anything to do with delicacy, but some people have a hard time working out in the real world, and it causes all kinds of mental problems. I have a niece that she was working at an apartment building, and she was the person who was supposed to be taking care of the apartment building. So she had to fix minor things. She didn't have to fix anything major, and she had to mow the lawn. Well, it was very, very stressful for her, as you can imagine. It's the only job she's ever had, and she failed miserably. She couldn't mow the lawn, it was too stressful, so her dad came over and mowed the lawn. If there was a light bulb that needed to be changed, her dad came over and changed the light bulb. Eventually it got to the point where she wasn't doing anything, and my brother was doing everything. So eventually they diagnosed her with schizophrenia, unable to do anything in her life. In recent years, there has been a surge in mental cases. One of the reasons is because there are more female workers out in the workplace. Are women that much weaker than other individuals? Not really. What's happening is that women are more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety and depression. And of course, for that reason, since there are more women out there working, then we see more workman's comp for anxiety and depression. Perhaps due to a shift in the job market from manufacturing industrial jobs to service-oriented jobs, yielding increases in job-related interpersonal stressors, as you can imagine. I do this to people all the time. They'll call me and they'll say, you just won a 2 nights and 3 days free stay at Branson, Missouri. Okay. Doesn't that sound great? I always say, not especially. Haven't ever wanted to go to Branson. But anyway, they'll go on with their spiel and on with their spiel, and eventually, of course, I won't do it, and of course, they don't get anything for that. They'll call their supervisor over, and their supervisor will want to talk to me. And I know this is very stressful for the person that I'm talking to, but I don't want to go to Branson. You know has anybody ever been to Branson, Missouri? Why the hell would you guys go to Missouri? It's right, it's in the Ozarks. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous place. But all the country western singers retire there. And then they'll buy an opera house or something. They'll have daily shows. Have you ever been to Branson? Have they ever offered you a trip to Branson for free? 2 nights and 3 days? Or is it 3 nights and 2 days? I can't remember. Anyway, I know that I'm harassing these individuals, and I'm probably driving them crazy. But you can imagine these individuals are suffering service-related stressors. Perhaps motivated primarily by financial incentives. There are some individuals that have only worked for a year or 2, and now they're on workers' compensation for the rest of their lives. When I was working in Omaha, I got a job as a supervisor for one of the departments in the hospital, and the person whose place I took had accumulated all this sick leave. So she claimed that she was under a lot of stress because they had fired her, because she was a jackass, but they had fired her. So she went on workman's comp for like 6 months. And I had to sign her sheet every 2 weeks. I had to sign a sheet that said that she was on workers' compensation. It was a mess. It was a mess. She didn't even have to prove anything. She was just they just wanted to get rid of her actually. So they were paying her all this workman's compensation. Really kind of a weird deal. But she worked for 6 months, or she didn't work for 6 months, and we paid her for 6 months of not work through workers' compensation. Researchers have considered questions such as what factors threaten the impartiality of forensic evaluations in workers' compensation cases. An expert who is repeatedly hired by the same attorney, whether a plaintiff's or defense attorney, they may risk opining what the attorney wants rather than rendering impartial opinions about each case. Remember, each side has their attorneys. So potentially Travis is going to sue the tribe for workers' compensation. His lawyer is going to say one thing, and the other lawyer, the tribe's lawyer, is going to say the very opposite. So your lawyer hires a psychologist and a doctor that will tell them that you're suffering and that you deserve compensation. Their lawyer is going to hire a doctor and a psychologist that says the very opposite. Now the reality is that your lawyer is going to hire somebody that always says that the person is suffering. And the other psychologist and the other doctor, of course, is probably an IHS doctor and potentially an IHS psychologist. And they always say that no, there's no suffering here. This man is very resilient. Look at some of the things that he does and how strong and how powerful you are and how resilient you are. Okay. That's the way it's going to go. Isn't that fun? The question of civil, or they may settle out of court, which makes a lot of sense. And they'll offer you, what they're going to offer you is your 3 months back pay at 66%. Now here's the kicker. Whatever you get, whatever compensation you get, your lawyer gets 1/3 of that. Okay. So if they offer you $1 million, which they won't, if they offer you $50,000, then he gets $15,000, and you get $35,000. That's the way it's going to go. Sorry. And I don't know who's, and potentially for hiring the doctor and the psychologist, that'll probably come out of your money, I'm guessing. Are you depressed yet?
Yeah. That's why I haven't pursued.
That's why you haven't done it. I mean, everybody gets paid and you get whatever pennies are left over. The question of civil competence focuses on whether an individual has the capacity to understand information that is relevant to decision making in a given situation, then make an informed choice about what to do in the situation. We're talking about civil competence. I have a brother that suffers from PTSD. He hasn't worked for, he probably hasn't worked for 20 years. He was a surveyor and he worked for the state. And while he was working for the state, people were afraid of him. And the reason people were afraid of him was because obviously he had PTSD. And they thought that the guy was going to go off on everybody. Well, he never did. He never went off on anybody. But sometimes they told him to do things and he said no. He wouldn't do it. They would ask him to sign off on something because some developer wanted to make a lot of money. And if he signed off on it, it usually had to do with how much they could encroach on the in Indiana, you own your property, but your property doesn't go all the way to the road. It goes, the state owns like 10 feet from the road. So if you own a property, you only own the property behind, and those 10 feet they own. Now, if you've ever been driven down the road, your road is here, and then you've got a ditch, right? Okay, that's what we're talking about. So if you buy a property your property doesn't go all the way to the road, or the middle of the road, that's not yours. The state has easements, it's called easement. And that's what his job was. His job was determining easement. Well, this is okay in rural areas where you've got roads and you've got ditches and you have people's property, it's not that big a deal. But when you're talking about residential areas, or not residential, but commercial areas, where they want to build a mall, usually they want to make that mall as big as they possibly can. So what they want is they want to encroach on the easement, is what they want to do. But they can't do that. And if they do it, of course, then they have broken the law, because that 10 feet from the road to the property line belongs to the state. And that's so that the state can plow snow off and just pile it on the sidewalks, so that they can build a ditch between, the road and the property. You certainly don't want to build right up to the edge, but commercial buildings are very often built right up to the edge of the easement. Of course, they're not supposed to do that. And that was his job, and sometimes he would say no. And sometimes they would offer to pay him extra money, and he would say no. This is the guy that when the speed limit says 55, he drives 55. He doesn't drive 56. When the speed limit goes down to 45, he hits his brakes, so he slows down to 45 miles an hour. That's how he always follows the law, and he always follows the rules. That's how he survived in combat. That's how he survived in Vietnam, was by following all the rules. And now this is his life. So everybody is afraid of him. My brother was when my mother died, and they had to distribute all of her property. It was my brother that was the what do they call it? He's the one that he oversaw the will. He's the one that did it. Now the question came up, and of course, he's had PTSD forever. The question came up: is he competent? Does he have civil competence? That was the question. My other brother wanted to do it, but it was because he wanted more money. Now my brother could have been paid. My brother Russell, my brother, who has PTSD. My brother John doesn't. But if my brother John had done it, he would have paid himself to do it. The executor of the will. He would have been the executor. The testator is what they call him. So the question was, does my brother have civil competence? Does he have the capacity to understand information that is relevant to decision-making in a given situation? That was the question. Then can he make an informed choice about what to do in that situation? So there were a couple of my brothers and sisters that said, no, he's had PTSD since Vietnam, so he's not civilly competent. And they could have gone to the state of Indiana and they could have said, hey, look, while he was there, you had him under observation, because you were afraid that he was going to go off on everybody and bring an AK-47 to work and blast everybody. So is he civilly competent? That was the question. And the answer was yes, he was civilly competent. And he did a really good job distributing the money. And he didn't take any pay to do it. He didn't take any pay, which my other brother would have done. Here are some questions that address issues of civil competence. Is one competent to manage his or her financial affairs? Of course, this had to do with money. It had to do with money and property. It had to do with stocks and bonds, and selling the stocks and bonds. That was one of the questions. Can one make competent decisions about medical or psychiatric treatment? And of course, this came up with when my mother was very ill. Of course, she was 97 years old. She got sicker as she got older, and so the question was, she had a DNR in her medical records. They had the doctors that she was seeing had never seen anybody this old before. I mean, she was old, really old. So they tried to treat her as if she were a 50 or 60-year-old, which doesn't work with 90-year-old people anyway. So the question was, who has control over my mother's medical situation? And the answer was, it wasn't, my brother Russell didn't do a very good job because he refused to go into hospitals. He had taken people to the hospital too often and watched them die. So he wasn't able to go into the hospital. When my father was dying, he didn't go. He didn't go to the funeral because he had conducted those funerals in Vietnam en masse, and he didn't want to do it anymore. So as far as medical or psychiatric treatment was concerned, he didn't do a very good job. With money, he's okay, but with medical treatment, he wasn't. Is one competent to execute a will and decide how to distribute property? And that was the big question. So since my brother has all of these problems, he has PTSD, the state of Indiana had a watch on him when he was working for the state. Is he civilly competent? It was the question. He didn't go to my mother or my father's funeral. He didn't go to my sister's funeral when she died. Is that normal? Well, you don't have to go to the funeral, do you? But the question was he civilly competent? So he was one of the executors of her will. It was between him and my older brother. And the question came up, since my older brother had borrowed so much money from the estate, would he treat the rest of us fairly, was the question. Huge question. So should we allow my brother that's suffering from PTSD, who can't go to the hospital, who can't go to the cemetery when somebody dies, should we let him be the executor of the will, or should we let my older brother do it? That was the question.
So who did it?
I'm sorry?
So who did it?
My younger brother did. Russell did.
The one with
The one with PTSD, the one that couldn't go to the funerals and couldn't see people who were sick. If somebody was sick, he just stayed out of the room. And it wasn't because he was afraid he'd get sick, it's because he saw so much of it. When he was in the military, he just didn't want to deal with it anymore. Okay.
Did he do it barely?
He did. And we knew he would, because this is the guy that drives 55 miles an hour in the when the speed limit's 55, and he goes down to 45 by hitting the brakes when the speed limit goes down to 45. So we knew he'd be fair. I mean, that was my rationale. So I knew he would be fair. And my younger brother thought he would be fair. And my sister thought he would be fair. But my older brother tried to claim that he was not civilly competent.
Did he get mad for that? Did he get mad over it?
I'm sorry?
Did he get mad over it?
No, because my brother knew what was going on. Everybody knew what was going on. The reason that my older brother had kept borrowing money from the estate was because it was his wife that wanted him to do it. So nobody trusted her. She was just after as much money as she could get. But we all knew my older brother, and he didn't really want to do it anyway, because they had borrowed. This is the my brother who his granddaughter was the one that had cooked meth in the house. Oh yeah, and so they caught her. They caught her, and he had to pay to have the house demolished. And he couldn't sell the property because it was contaminated. So yeah, he had just borrowed $8,000 to have the house demolished. And the mother kept going, his wife kept going, oh, no, it's okay. She's wonderful. She's the most perfect child in the world. Other people are the ones that are making her do all these things. Wouldn't admit that her granddaughter had a problem. My great niece. Can a person make advanced decisions about the kind of medical treatment he or she wants or does not want to receive if terminally ill or seriously injured? And of course, this kind of thing happens. I was reading a book about a neuroscientist who had brain cancer, had brain tumors. And while she was having brain tumors, of course, her decision-making capabilities were very limited. And because of that, she made some really stupid mistakes, despite the fact she was a neuroscientist. So the reality is sometimes your brain gets affected by cancer. She had tumors, obviously, and so she couldn't make decisions about her own life, as strange as that may sound. The competent individual is expected to be able to understand basic information that is relevant to making decisions. They need to apply that information to a specific situation in order to anticipate the consequences of various choices. And of course, my brother has that capability. As long as there's not somebody dying, I mean, my mother was already dead, so that aspect wasn't part of seeing over the will or executing the will. He did a great job, I assume. Maybe he's sitting there with a big pile of cash that I don't know about, but I doubt it. My dad had accumulated money throughout his life, and he bought all these stocks and whatnot. So he had this big pile of money. And it was worth about $1 million. And then this was in 2008. If you remember what happened in 2008, all the stocks just tanked. So all of a sudden, our $1 million went down to about $500,000. So then now, before nobody really cared because there was so much money. We were all going to get a big pile of money. But all of a sudden, it went down from $200,000 apiece to $100,000 apiece. And now we got a problem because everybody was, and especially my one older brother had already spent almost all of his money. He'd already spent $100,000, so he wasn't getting anything. And sometimes he had to pay money back to the estate. I know, it's kind of a strange situation. So we were afraid to make him the executor because he was sitting there with no cash at all. And the rest of us were sitting there with maybe $100,000. Anyway. Use logical or rational thinking to evaluate the pros and cons of various strategies and decisions. Communicate the personal decision or the choice. So you have to make personal decisions. What happened over the weekend? 23 people died in the fires in California. They're moving so rapidly they can't. People are 23 have died. They're moving so rapidly that people are getting caught in their cars. And of course, a burning car is not someplace that you want to be. Not the best way to go, of course. I don't know if I'd take a fire over drowning. It's kind of a toss-up. They're both pretty ugly ways to go. Yeah, you hope that you die fairly quickly, I guess. Not usually the way it works. Planning about future medical treatments is formalized through what is known as Advanced Medical Directives, AMDs, Advanced Medical Directives, in which patients indicate what kinds of treatment they want should they later become incapacitated and incompetent to make treatment decisions. And this is known as the living will. Living wills are relatively new. They've only been around for 20 or 30 years. Before that, of course, whatever the doctor wanted to do, the doctor did. But now, of course, you can say, don't DNR, do not resuscitate if I start to go. I had an uncle that had a heart attack. I had an uncle, he was from Kentucky. He was one of those, Southern gentlemen. And, everything was perfect with him. His face was perfect. His teeth were perfect. Everything was perfect. He always had his hair combed just right. He was a military officer, oddly enough. And he had been through World War II. But here he is, he's wandering around. And Mr. Perfect, walking around. His hair is always perfect. His teeth are always perfect. He's got these strange pale blue eyes that look like some kind of a demon eyes. Anyway, so he has a heart attack, and the EMTs came over, and they're trying to resuscitate him, and he wouldn't open his mouth. So they had to break his teeth out, his front teeth out, to intubate him. I know. Him and his perfect white teeth. I mean, he had these gorgeous, gorgeous teeth, and they had to bust him in order to get to intubating. Eventually, he died, of course. I mean, he didn't survive the heart attack. But if he had had a living will, this is before living wills, he could have said, do not resuscitate, and he would have been a gorgeous corpse. As it turned out, they had to put in fake teeth, and they weren't nearly as good as what they should have been. Anyway, poor old Uncle Jack. died of a heart attack. But advanced medical directives have to do with what you want to do when you die. You know, these are decisions that people have to make. Do I want to be buried? Do I want to be cremated? Do I want, you know, where do I want to go? These are all in your living will, as it turns out. My wife and I talk about this all the time. Since we're both medical people, and she has written up thousands of these living will things. And she wants to know, what do you want to do when you die? Oh, great, let me think about that. You know, in 100 years after I die, I think I want to be cremated. Take my old bones and just cook them. The question of competence to consent to treatment can arise when one refuses treatment that seems to be justified. The AMA makes mistakes all the time. One of the mistakes they've made recently is within the last 20 years, they decided that they weren't treating pain as well as they should. Yeah, I know, this happened in 2001 actually. So in 2001, the AMA decided we needed to start using, we needed to give people better pain control. So they started throwing opiates at people en masse by the bucket load. Once upon a time, when I had my knee surgery, I had my knee surgery in 2003. Anyway, they did orthoscopic surgery. He sent me home with 15 hydrocodone. I know, I took one of them, it didn't work, so I didn't use it anymore. I just used Tylenol. But I had enough for a whole, I could have marketed those things. I could have made a lot of money off of those 15 pills. I didn't need 15 pills. I mean, my pain was gone after a couple days. So what am I using 15 pills for? Why did I need 15 pills? He sent me home with more pills than I needed. But the problem was, of course, the AMA has decided that they need to treat people's pain and that we need to take all this pain away. This is a mistake because it has caused the opioid crisis in the United States. There's a problem with heroin, of course there's a problem with heroin. But it has gotten worse because we are throwing people hydrocodone and OxyContin by the bucket load. We're giving people way too many painkillers. And if they have pain, of course, one of the problems with pain is that if you have a pain in a select place in your body and we give you a medication to block that pain, eventually the pain is going to reroute itself around whatever you're blocking. We know that happens. So what do you do now? Give them more opioids? Yeah, that's what they've been doing. And this is a problem that, that people have with opioids. The AMA also came out with a decision. I'm going to talk about sexual parts. They also came out with a decision about prostate examinations. Prostate is only boys have prostates. We have prostates so that we can accumulate semen. It's the way it works. But sometimes if you don't use these things right, then they block up or they swell up. And now you've got swollen prostate. Prostate is an organ that encircles your urethra, and if it swells up, then it blocks off your urethra, or it's hard to urinate. Okay, so this is a problem, right? And we don't want this to happen with men, and this is why you have all those dumb commercials on television about having to go to the bathroom all the time. It's because of their prostate gland. So what do we do with the prostate gland? Well, we can actually measure the amount of the enzyme coming out of the prostate gland, the PSA. We can measure the PSA, and we can tell you whether it's high or whether it's normal. And if it's high, of course, then possibly you have a swollen prostate. But there's another way to check the prostate. The prostate gland is right next to your rectum. So what a doctor can do, he can stick his finger up the rectum and he can palpate the prostate gland. Okay, so that's the other way that we can check it. But if you have a normal PSA, then you don't need the digital exam. Okay. And that was the way it was forever. If you had a normal PSA, you didn't have to worry about your prostate gland. And then it came out that there are false negatives. There are No, there's false positives.
Mhm.
Wait a minute.
The false positives.
Is that right? Are they false positives or false negatives? So we see sometimes the PSA is elevated when it's not supposed to be, so they're false positives. Okay. False positives. All right. That means that if you have a normal PSA, you're okay. But there are sometimes false positives, which means sometimes you have a abnormally high PSA, but you don't have any problem with your prostate. Okay. So the logic is that as long as your PSA is normal, then you don't need a digital exam. Does that make sense? But the AMA came out and said everybody needs a digital exam. That's what they came out with. Now that's backwards, because if it were a false negative, if sometimes the PSA was normal and it should have been elevated, now it would have made sense to do digital exams on it. Right? Okay. So the AMA has come out with new protocols saying everybody needs a digital exam. Well, they don't, because there are false positives, not false negatives. If there were false negatives, then yes, they would be correct. Being a laboratory technician, I know what a false positive and a false negative are. So the last time I went to the doctor, I'm 70 years old. I'm supposed to have they're supposed to check my prostate gland. And I said, sure, I'll take the PSA. He said, no. New protocol says you're supposed to have, but I had just read that it was a false positive, not a false negative. I said, that's the dumbest thing I've ever read. That doesn't make sense. That's backwards. That's completely backwards. And I explained it to him. He said, you're right. I don't know why they came out with that. I told my doctor something.
So they figured out what's causing the false positives?
He just wanted to stick his finger up my butt. That was it.
It's just their strange desires.
I know. And I said, no, my PSA is normal, and there are false positives, but there are no false negatives, so no, you're not going to do it. And he didn't. So there you go. I'm still a virgin. Okay. Write that down. If simplifying the information doesn't help, then one can administer a clinical assessment instrument such as the MacArthur Competence Assessment Tool for treatment decisions to determine whether the patient lacks the necessary ability to reach a competent decision. And of course, sometimes when you're sick, you don't really want to, you can't make these decisions. If you've got a fever, you can't make these decisions. If you've got a problem with your frontal cortex, you can't make these decisions. But most people, of course, can, when they're in the hospital, decide whether they're going to take the medication or not. Now this gets to be a problem because we have more and more people with Alzheimer's disease. We have more and more people with dementia. And one of the things that happens when somebody starts suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's disease, they get very defensive. That's the first thing that happens. So you tell them, well, I told you that you needed to, you had an appointment on Thursday and you forgot. And they, no, I didn't forget, you didn't tell me. It's one of those kind of deals that start happening. Now they're losing their competence. Obviously they're losing their competence. They can't remember things. So who needs to start making decisions for them? Well, taking away their ability to make decisions or their responsibility to make decisions is usually a huge deal with people. Nobody wants to be subordinate to anybody else. I mean, especially people that have been in charge of things all of their lives. All of a sudden, you're making decisions for them, and they don't want it to happen. That's what happened with my mother. My mother was lucid up until about the last 2 or 3 months of her life. And boy, I'll tell you what, she fought tooth and nail. She wanted to kill herself. She was so pissed off that other people were making decisions for her, especially medical people, because she knows how dumb they really are. She was a nurse for like 70 years. Oh, she's longer than that, more like 75 years. And she knows how dumb these doctors really are. And of course, I was up in Montana. No, I wasn't. I was in Iowa at that point. Clinicians can evaluate whether a person called a testator was competent to execute a will. Such competence is a requirement for the will to be valid, of course. If you have somebody who's not really competent, and the question was my brother competent to testate the will or to be the executor of the will? And the answer was yes, he did a really good job. And the only person that argued with it was my sister-in-law and my brother-in-law. It wasn't my brother it wasn't really my brother that was arguing, it was my sister-in-law. And it was my sister's husband. He was saying, no, because he was after some more money too. And as it turned out, of course, my brother did a great job. I'm assuming. The legal standards for testators, and actually, after the will was probated, he printed all this stuff out, and half of it was in handwriting. Of course, he doesn't use a computer, doesn't like computers. He doesn't have cable television, he has an antenna on top of his house. That's my brother. Anyway, so he printed all this stuff out and gave us all this stuff. And of course, I trusted him all the way through. I mean, what if he stole $50,000? Do I need $50,000? Actually, it would be $10,000 because it would be divided by 5.
I don't know, the way you've been paying for your firewood around here, you just...
I know. I have the world's supply of firewood. Who was I talking to? Oh, Robert Bearclough is my neighbor. He's 2 houses down, and he keeps commenting on my big pile of wood. So I told him, come over and take it as much as you want, Robert. Yeah, that's going to happen. And my other neighbor he has bought oak. That's all he's got is oak. So he has no aspen. Of course, you have to start your fire with aspen. I told him, come over and, I've got, 13 loads of aspen, so come over and take as much as you want. Anyway, so we'll see what happens. If anybody needs a little extra wood, just to start your fire, sure, come on over, I guess. Why not? The legal standard for testators' competence to execute a will, the testators must know at the time of the making of their wills that they are making their wills, and we're talking about the individual that is writing the will here. They must know the nature and the extent of their property. They've got to know how much something is worth. They must know the natural objects of their bounty. In other words, we're talking about property here, we're talking about cars and whatnot. I had a neighbor in Iowa. He had a Hudson Hawk. And Hudson Hawk is a type of car. They stopped making them like in 1949. And he had a 47 Hudson Hawk. That's probably worth, well, it's hard to tell how much it's worth. It was pretty torn up on the inside. But he thought the thing was worth, $100,000, and the damn thing was worth maybe $10,000. Anyway, sometimes we overestimate what something is worth. My dad worked in a bank, and he used to accumulate old coins. Well, I don't know if you know anything about coins, but usually they're not really worth a whole lot. I mean, you got a penny from 1832. How much is that thing worth? Well, that's worth maybe $1. Well, it's 100 times how much its face value. But it's still only $1, okay? So he has this whole bag of coins, and my sister's just salivating because these are all these old coins, and we go through them all, we look them up on the internet, and you've got face value is probably $2, and so when we looked them all up, it was worth like $32.
Yeah.
I know.
And I have a nickel that I turned into $48 over the 3 years. The value on it's been going up. So the one I'm trying to look for right now is a 2005 nickel.
You want a 2005 nickel? Let me see how if I can do it.
That's the one I'm looking for, is a 2005 nickel. And there's the
Why are you
one,
looking for a 2005 nickel? Is it worth anything?
it's worth quite a bit. Depending on which nickel it is, which 2005 nickel. There's one that's worth nothing at all, and the one that everyone was looking for is like worth $500,000.
$500,000
Yeah.
for a nickel?
Yeah. And then there's this one collection that I'm doing with pennies, which is practically not worth anything, but it's just enough for collector stuff, you know.
2009.
Yeah, 2005 is hard to find.
Okay.
The other one I'm collecting is the 100-year anniversary of when the penny first came out. And then on that one first edition, there's like 4 different pictures of Lincoln.
Oh, you're talking about a penny.
Yeah, so it has like all that on there. So I've gotten halfway through. I need 2 more to complete my collection.
Well, I'll keep looking for the 2005 nickel. You're welcome.
That's why I got it.
They must know the manner in which the wills they are making distribute their property. My parents owned a 20-acre farm. Eventually, they ended up with a 20-acre farm. The question was, and it's probably worth, I don't know, a couple $100,000, I guess. It's right in the middle of a residential area in Indiana. Right now, they're farming half of it. So the question is, what were we going to do with the property? And the answer was, my brother, who has PTSD, they were going to leave him on the property and let him live on the property until he dies, and then that will be distributed among the kids that are still surviving. I have a sister that has already died, so instead of dividing everything by 6, they divided everything by 5. And when my brother dies, if he ever does, then we'll sell the property and we'll distribute it among the survivors. Now, personally, I'm going to live a really long time, so I'll probably get some of the money from the property. My brothers and my sister don't live as a healthy a lifestyle as I do. So we'll see what happens. I'm going to make it. I'm going to be the last one standing this thing. My brother that lives in the house is, he's all by himself. He's got PTSD. He's kind of fat, but he only eats chocolate chip cookies. He eats a lot of bacon. What else does he eat? Lasagna, but Stouffer's. It's like Stouffer's, that plastic stuff. Okay. What else does he eat? And it's got a lot of garlic in it. I don't know. Maybe it's going to keep him alive forever. And he doesn't watch television or have the internet at his house. I know. How long can he live? And he drinks Coke by the bucket load.
That's diabetes right
There you go. Well, no, not in my family. We don't have diabetes in my family. The evaluations include a determination of the purpose.
It's your brother. It's your brother.
Stop talking about me.
Well, I watched your link on YouTube. Quit talking about me.
He heard what I was saying. A determination of the purpose of the will and why it was written at the time. Evaluations include a determination of the purpose of the will and why it was written at the time. This is one of the reasons. Somebody trying to borrow money.
See, you need that 50K.
I need the 50,000 to distribute on the reservation. Okay, I'll remember that. A determination of the purpose of the will and why it was written at the time. A lot of individuals want to change their will. I had an aunt that was worth $37 million, and she was a rich lady, and the reason. So she didn't like anybody. She didn't trust anybody because she thought everybody was after her money. So she kept changing her will. And the last one anybody heard about, she was going to distribute. She had 2 surviving sisters, and she was going to distribute the money evenly between the 2 sisters. That was like 15 years ago, or 15 years before she died. She died, and she was being taken care of by one of her sisters. When they opened her will, it turned out that she had changed her will. She'd given all of her money. When her husband died, her husband was a Shriner, and he tried to give like half of his wealth to the Shriners Children's Hospital down in St. Louis, the Burn Center in St. Louis. And she contested the will, and she won. So she took all this money, all these millions of dollars away from all these bird kids down in St. Louis. What a horrible thing to do. So she took that money and she parlayed it. She started buying stocks and she parlayed it into, you know, a bigger and bigger and bigger pile of money. So here she dies with $37 million. So she gave 10% of it to the Shrine Burn Hospital down in St. Louis. And the other 90% she gave to the Huguenot House in Chicago. Well, the Huguenots were a group of, it's a religious group from France that they were a Protestant group, and they fought against the Catholics in France. Oh, it's just a horrible, horrible story. And then the Catholics drive them out, and they all come over here to the Americas, and some of them ended up in Arcadia, up north, and some of them ended up in Virginia and Massachusetts. Anyway, the Huguenots. And so I have Huguenot ancestry. They became the Cajuns down in Louisiana. Anyway, so it's this odd Protestant sect. But they had this thing about selling their daughters. They would marry their daughter. They were all beautiful people, theoretically, except my family, of course. And then they were all these beautiful, beautiful, short women with big chests. You know, they were these little short, chesty ladies. And so they married them off to all these wealthy people in Virginia and whatnot. Anyway, they built this huge mansion in Chicago. And so she gives the rest of her $32 million to the Huguenot house in Chicago. And nobody in the family got a penny from all of those millions of dollars. I'm just trying to, I know, everybody's crying. They don't have more money to distribute on the reservation. As sad as that is. Gathering information about the property holdings, insight into the family dynamics, and of course this has to do with, I mean, my brother contested the fact that my other brother should have been the executor of the will. You know, the family dynamics, a lot of times it's not brothers and sisters, a lot of times it's in-laws that are fighting about this kind of stuff. When my wife's family, when her parents started dying off, they started fighting over the stuff that was in her house, as strange as that is. Of course, we were in Japan at the time, so it's not like we could run over and grab a crystal chandelier or whatever. So her sister came down from Seattle, Washington, or not Seattle, Spokane. She lived in Spokane. Drove all the way to Atlanta in a U-Haul truck and loaded up all of her stuff out of her house. I know. Family dynamics. So everybody's pissed off at this lady. Anyway. People fighting over money. An assessment of the general consequences of the dispositions, and of course all this has to do with evaluation of the individual writing a will. Clinicians may be called on to give an opinion about the deceased person's state of mind as it existed at a specific time before death. A lot of times what happens with an individual as they're dying, they go into what is known as terminal drop. Terminal drop has to do with the fact that they start focusing inward instead of outward. So they don't want to hear the arguments, they don't want to listen to any of that stuff, they start focusing inward. And it's referred to as terminal drop. Of course, I used to work in the hospital, and so I saw this over and over and over again. You'd have somebody, and you'd go in, and they'd make conversation with you, and then you draw the blood, and everybody's happy, and you leave them laughing. I always tried to leave everybody laughing when I was working in the hospital. Anyway, so about 2 weeks before they would die, a lot of times their focus, you couldn't engage them in conversation anymore. You just went in, drew their blood and took off. And you didn't leave them laughing because these people were focused on staying alive. And usually that's what it has to do with. They're marshaling all their energy just to be able to be there. And this is known as terminal drop. And we see this all the time with people that are dying. So, these stories about somebody's dying, and you go to their bedside, and they have this, when you become 27 years old, you need to do this, and you need to expand yourself. This kind of stuff doesn't really happen because these people are usually focused on just not being dead the next minute. And it's known as terminal drop. So a lot of times, if they write a will when they're in this mindset, is that a good will? Would be the question. So a lot of times they call in a psychiatrist, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist to look at their mindset during the time when they wrote the will. And this is known as a psychological autopsy. Somebody suffering from dementia, somebody is in terminal drop. The question is, are they lucid enough to be able to change their will? And of course, if somebody is suffering from dementia, it's kind of easy to get them to change something. A lot of times they'll just do stuff. When somebody's in terminal drop, a lot of times they're like a child and they'll just do anything you say. They'll repeat anything you say. So this would not be a good time for them to change their will. So a lot of times what will happen is a psychologist will go in and they will, after the person has died, they'll talk to a lot of individuals to try to determine what was their mindset when they died. And of course that's known as a psychological autopsy. Most autopsies rely on information from two sources: interviews with third parties who knew the decedent and prior records. So you can look at what kind of a person were they before, you look at their personality profile from before to see if it has changed. And then you'll talk to people that were there when they died, third parties who knew them, and ask them how they felt about the individual. Were they the same lucid person that they were before? One of the things that my mother started doing before she died, she was in the hospital the day before she died. Yeah, she was in the hospital, and they sent her home. And I figured they'd send her home to die, which is a nice place to die. It's better than a hospital. Of course, she hated hospitals because she was a nurse, so she hated hospitals. And she was always swearing at everybody because, they did stupid shit. And she would say, this is stupid. This shit you're doing is stupid. She stopped swearing like 3 days before she died. She stopped swearing almost completely, except the last time I talked to her, she called me little shit, which I thought was kind of interesting because she'd given up swearing, and here she swore at me. I don't know if that's good or bad. As confusing as that is. Anyway, reliability of psychological autopsy is probably fairly low. And the problem is, of course, you didn't get to talk to the person before they died. You don't know how lucid they actually were. One of the problems with third-party interviews is the fact that most people are trying, it's like when your kid's bad. You're the last person to see it, right? You're always rationalizing the fact that your child is doing something wrong. So we try to see things in as positive light as possible. Like my sister-in-law, who won't admit that her granddaughter is a meth head and was on heroin while she was pregnant, which just about killed the kid, killed the baby. But she won't admit that it was the wrong thing to do, because that's the way she sees things. So a lot of times third parties are not the most accurate individuals to talk to. As far as my aunt was concerned, I remember I had an aunt that was rich, and she was being taken care of by my other aunt. Well, according to the other aunt, when she changed wills, when she did anything, it was okay because she was taking care of her. And if she wasn't okay, then it would have shown that she wasn't doing a very good job of taking care of her. So a lot of times third parties are not very accurate. And for that reason, autopsies tend to have not be very accurate as well. How was testimony about psychological autopsies fared in court? In cases involving workers' compensation claims and questions of whether insurance benefits should be paid, the courts have usually admitted psychological autopsy testimony. This has to do with money, usually doesn't have to do with large sums of money, but relatively small sums of money, and for that reason, they are relatively well accepted. However, in criminal cases or in cases involving the question of whether a person had the mental capacity to execute a will, the courts have been more reluctant to permit the testimony of a psychological autopsy. Psychological autopsies are usually done by somebody that has never met the individual. They're making assumptions. This is like doing a diagnosis of Donald Trump from what you read in the news. You really can't do it. It's not accurate. You know, I can call him a narcissist all day long, sure looks like he is, but I'm seeing a tainted picture of him. I have never really talked to the guy, so I have no idea whether he has any problems at all. He may be the most lucid guy in the world. Just ask him. What does he call himself? An unacknowledged genius, I think is what he calls himself. And maybe he is, I don't know. Okay, so we need to talk about child custody laws. Of course, my family just came in contact with child custody laws of Florida because we were trying to get my grandson moved to Iowa, and his father contested it. So he was trying to make him the ward of Florida, the state of Florida. Since my daughter and my grandson's father, let's call him the baby daddy. How's that? That way we'll know. The baby daddy and my daughter had never gone to court, and he wasn't paying child support. Legally, he wasn't paying child support. Then he wasn't the ward of the state of Florida. But as soon as he started contesting it, of course, he became a ward of the state of Florida. He became a citizen of the state of Florida. The courts became involved. So the courts had something to do with the welfare of my grandson, despite the fact he was being taken care of. There was no question as to whether he was being taken care of. All of a sudden, the courts became involved. And after that happened, he became a ward of the state of Florida. So they had to make a decision as to whether my daughter could move from Florida, move the child out of Florida, or whether he had to stay there. That was what the court had to decide. So at that point, he was a ward of the state of Florida, despite the fact he had a mother that was taking care of him 24/7, and he had a father that potentially was taking care of him on select weekends and almost every holiday. So the best interest of the child is the new watchword of divorce courts, of child custody courts. It's the best interest of the child, and that is the law in the state of Florida. So if they could have proven that moving to Iowa was detrimental to the child, if he had so many relatives there that he was going to not have contact with, if he had so many friends, if he was going to school and doing very, very well in Florida, then potentially they could have decided that he couldn't have moved out of the state of Florida, and my daughter would have had to have stayed there. So they went through a child custody case one summer. It cost me lots of money. Not important. Evaluating families for the purpose of recommending a custodial arrangement that is in the best interest of the child whose parents are divorcing or separating is a fast-growing area. And this is relatively new. Once upon a time, and it wasn't that long ago, 20 years ago or so, the mother always gained custody of the child. In the state of Texas, the father always retained custody of the child, whether he was taking care of the child or not. Because all children were the property of the father. That was in the state of Texas. As confusing as all that is. The increase in these cases is attributable to two facts. Before the 1970s, the number of divorces in the United States was relatively minuscule. Most states had laws that you couldn't get a divorce. And the only way you could get a divorce, you guys don't believe this, but I know because everybody's getting a divorce now, but the reality is that 50 years ago, you couldn't get a divorce. You couldn't get a divorce in any state except for Nevada. I know you think that this is weird, and this must not be true. This must be a historical non-entity that doesn't have anything to do with you. But the reality is that, of course, I'm that old. I am so old. How old are you? I'm so old that when I got married, divorces were all but illegal in the state of Indiana. So I couldn't get a divorce. Luckily, they changed the laws in 1970. I got divorced in 1973. If I'd had to live with that lady, I mean, after she stabbed me 3 times, I don't know, I probably wouldn't have survived. About 50% of all marriages in the United States end in divorce today. So if you get married, the probability that you'll stay together is not that high. It's only 1 out of 2. And of course, I've been divorced twice, so I've already taken up one of those slots. So you guys are probably okay, I'm guessing. If you're Catholic, you're not supposed to get a divorce. And there's a relatively large percentage of Catholics in the United States. About 1/3 of all the people in the United States are Catholic. So theoretically, 1/3 of all people that get married don't get a divorce. What does that mean? That means there's a lot of Protestants getting divorced, is what that means. 50% of all marriages in the United States end in divorce. As of 2010, 34% of households with children in the United States were single-parent households. They were a household usually without a father. Sometimes it's not without a mother. My household was a household without a mother. And I was a single parent for 5 years. I was a single parent from 1973 until 1979. That's 6 years. Oh, my second divorce, I'm sorry. 1974 to 1979. I got remarried in 1979. So I was a single parent for 5 years. Yeah, I got married. I got divorced in May of 1974, and I got remarried in June of 1979. So that's 5 years almost on the nose, as it turns out. Okay, so we're talking about increases in the cases of attributable. Reference for maternal custody diminished at the beginning of the 21st century. Before 2000, the probability was that the mother got custody. Of course, in 1974, when I got my second divorce, I had to fight for the custody of my children. Not with my wife, who was gone. She was not even in the state. I had to fight with the state for custody of my children. And unfortunately, my judge, and I think I've told you this story, but the judge was a Baptist minister, and he did not believe that a man could raise a child. Because he was kind of an interesting fellow. I mean, he was a Baptist minister, and he didn't believe that men could take care of children. And he told me before he lost the case. Well, he didn't really lose the case. I didn't really win the case. What happened was he was going to take custody of my children. But I was not a citizen of the state of Texas. I was a citizen of the state of Indiana. My children were children from the state of Indiana. They were both born in Indiana. So they weren't citizens of the state of Texas. He couldn't do that without seizing them. And he would have had to have seized them, not from me, but from the state of Indiana, in order to make them wards of the state of Texas. He would have had to have done that. And of course, the state of Indiana, of course, was allowing divorces. They were allowing custody for men. So he had no legs to stand on. And so that's how I won my kids. I was not the citizen of the state of Texas. Now many courts want to know about the parenting abilities of each parent before deciding custody. Is he a better parent, or is the mother a better parent? Currently, the prevailing standard for custody decisions is the future best interest of the child. And of course, this is what came up with my daughter and the baby daddy of my grandson. So that's what they had to decide. My daughter was making top dollar. She was a teacher. She'd been a teacher in Florida for 17 years. She was making $46,000. When she moved to Iowa, she got a contract for $60,000. So she was making more money. It's cheaper to live in Iowa than it is in Florida. So all this looks pretty good as far as her case was concerned. But it went on and on and on. Strangely enough, it went on and on and on. Mainly because the baby daddy, his family has a lot of money. And because of that, he was able to hire a really good lawyer. The lawyer was arguing all these really stupid points. And because of that, he was able to drag it out. And he also lied about his family, caring about my grandson, his family, strangely enough. Okay. Stress of initial separation for the child, risk factors that the child is involved in, that involve the child. Stress of initial separation for the child, of course, being separated from the non-custodial parent. Diminished parenting, of course, since there's only one there instead of two. Loss of significant relationships, including extended family, such as grandparents and friends. And when he left Florida, he left a set of grandparents. But he was coming to live with another set of grandparents, or live near another set of grandparents. Of course, I got a job down here, so I'm not there. But my wife is. My wife, and that's the reason why she's not here. She's up there helping take care of my grandson. Friends, friends that they may potentially have. He has a best friend that lives in Florida, and he sees him every once in a great while. And that kind of rips him apart a little bit, being separated from his friends. But having been military, we used to move every 2 or 3 years. And kids usually find new friends. That's the way it works usually. Anyway, this came up, how, all these friends that my grandson had. Multiple moves, including changing schools and loss of friends, and this was huge. The school, what school was he going to now? Well, he's going to a pretty good school down in Florida. But he's going to a gold ribbon school, a blue ribbon school, it's a blue ribbon gold medal school in Iowa. He's going to a really good school. And that kind of tipped the scales a little bit. That and the fact that she was making $16,000 more in Iowa than she was in Florida. Personally, I think Florida is a swamp. You can quote me if you like. The damn place, as soon as the glaciers start melting, it's going to disappear. Okay? It's a swamp. It was a swamp before. The Okefenokee is down there. The whole place is underwater. It's ridiculous. Mosquitoes, it's hot, it's humid. Wouldn't you much rather live in Iowa? Let's take a vote. Sharon, where would you rather live? Iowa or Florida? Iowa, there we go. That's all I need to know. We'll assume that she knows what she's talking about. Why don't we stop right here? We'll pick this up next time. And I'll talk more about my daughter.